Hey guys. Yurizy here. This is part 5 of What If Sakura Became Independent. Hit like and subscribe, and also don't forget to check the author. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 29, Chronophobia, Part 1. When no one immediately spoke, Sakura was cringing in anticipation, Naruto shamefaced but stubborn because Sasuke wasn't speaking, and Sasuke wearing the iciest expression he could muster. Kakashi sighed. Fine. We'll do it your way, Kakashi-sensei said flatly. Sakura, when your teammates have decided that the best way to settle their differences is a public duel, I don't care about the property damage you caused separating them. That'll come out of their pay. Is your arm all right? When she hesitated, glancing over at Sasuke, who was pointedly not looking at her, he ordered, "Go have someone look at that." Now? Sakura asked, because though it hurt, she'd been really hurt before. And this conversation seemed like a very important one. His single visible eye narrowed, but when she tucked in her chin and met his stare mulishly, he relented. I suppose you're owed just as much of an explanation as I am, since you're the one who ended it. Now, who wants to tell me why it seemed like a good idea to use lethal techniques to settle your differences? I didn't teach you Chidori to have you use it against your teammate, Sasuke, any more than Jiraiya would have taught you that particular technique if he'd known what use you'd put it to, Naruto. I don't care if you lost your temper. I don't care that you didn't think. That wouldn't have made either of you any less dead if Sakura hadn't interfered. From the moment you step past the academy doors, you're taught to respect your weapons, that they're tools, not toys. Ninjutsu isn't any different. Yes, Kakashi-sensei, Naruto agreed miserably, staring down at his hand and then clenching it into a fist. I wasn't thinking. I was just so pissed. But it won't happen again, he promised. Because, just cause you didn't mean it doesn't mean anything, not if someone gets hurt. Kakashi-sensei spared the remorseful Gen in a brief smile. There are always accidents during training and no will hold those against you, but that is one technique that is never appropriate to use during sparring. Naruto, glancing down at the crater he'd left, winced and nodded. Attention turned to Sasuke, whose eyes were shadowed by temper, not regret. He scowled at Kakashi-sensei, lips barely parting as he muttered, "Got it." Kakashi-sensei's brow rose. Really? He queried. Then I suppose you won't mind walking Sakura down and explaining why she has minor electrical burns? There were clear lines of tension in Sasuke's jaw as he stalked toward the door. Sakura wasn't certain whether she was meant to follow, but when he reached the door, he turned and gave a look that was a silent demand to follow. She trailed him silently, Naruto staying behind with Kakashi-sensei. She could hear the low, indistinct murmur of their voices as she followed her dark-haired teammate down the empty stairwell. Once Sasuke had made her uncomfortable through sheer embarrassment, too afraid of looking less than her best to ever really be at ease with him. Now it was unease that made the hair on her arms prickle as their footsteps echoed, the stairwell creating a sense of intimacy despite the people that were just on the other side of the doors. She'd feared fire first and conquered that fear, but now it was Sasuke himself. Or, perhaps, a Sasuke less than himself. Sakura couldn't forget him in the grips of that seal, and though she couldn't see that living tattoo peeking from under his collar, the look on his face as he'd launched himself at Naruto bore an awful resemblance to the one he'd worn back then. She was occupied with considering the idea of never really feeling safe with Sasuke again when he spoke. "Thank you," he grunted, almost too soft for her to hear. Sakura didn't have to ask him to clarify. She still didn't feel comfortable, the scent of sweat and ozone too much for that as he paused to let her catch up, but she felt better, lighter somehow. Team 7 might never be Team 10, but there was still time for them to find their own balance. Kill your heroes. Sakura had just gotten her vest back from tailoring when she received the notice from the mission office. Zipping up the vest and settling it as comfortably as she could manage over her habitual outfit, she wasn't going to wear the standard uniform unless it was a formal occasion. Sakura was surprised to find that her trepidation was almost swallowed by her eagerness to not see the reminders of the recent invasion whenever she stepped out the door. Also, a mission would distract her from the fact that her mother was coming home. Just for a little while on leave, but it would be long enough. Sakura didn't know if she could or should tell her about everything that had happened since she'd become a genin. She'd been worried enough that her daughter had already made chunin. Proud, yes, but worried, just as she'd been when she'd heard about Sakura's team roster. Her mother's team had drifted apart when two of its members had taken support positions, and the other had been absorbed by another team undergoing similar growing pains as young genin found career paths they wanted to follow. Her father's team, by contrast, had remained intact. The Sakura first assigned to Team 7 had thought she'd follow Sasuke anywhere, but now, a little more battered and a little wiser, she could read between the lines of her mother's letter and see that Mabuki had hoped that she'd find her calling a little further from the battlefield. Her mother clearly knew what a field promotion implied. Konoha had taken her heaviest casualties among her field shinobi. With this promotion, without a non-combat specialization, her career as it stood ended in an urn or as a jounin. Sakura bundled all that up and set it aside as best she could as she reported to the mission office. The Hokage herself was giving mission briefs this morning, which gave Sakura an additional incentive to nervousness above and beyond the absence of her teammates. Shino was there, however, and Tenten slid in the door only moments after Sakura. Sakura's brows soared even higher when Hinata peeked around the door, then was gently shoved inside by Ino. The five of them, well, alright, the four girls, stared curiously at one another as Tsunade-sama finished briefing an older team on a C rank. When the door had closed beyond them, they were waved forward. Well, Tsunade-sama said, resting her chin on her interlaced hands, here's your first taste of a mission outside of your genin team, without any jounin to supervise. I'll do broad strokes for you. The details will be provided in the mission packet. There's a Ryokan in the south that's been having some trouble with a group of bandits that have moved into the area. We suspect the bandits of having some ninja training, because local law enforcement hasn't been able to track them back to their base. It's a small group, no more than 10, and on the grounds of the inn they've confined themselves so far to making lewd comments to the Nakai and demanding food be prepared and served. But they're growing more aggressive about harassing the girls, and recently the travelers they've been accosting aren't just being robbed, they're being badly beaten as well. In our last communication with Gion-san, it was done basically at her doorstep. So, before any of her Nakai are raped or any of her guests murdered, Gion-san commissioned us to take care of her problem. You three genin are going to replace the Nakai, several of whom have returned home until the problem is taken care of. A Ryokan's reputation is its lifeblood, which is why Gion-san isn't willing to let her service of what guests are still coming to suffer while we get the rest of it straightened out. In theory, you're young enough that even if the bandits think that you're shinobi, they won't consider you a threat. Your leads for this mission will be Aburame and Haruno, who have the responsibility of tracking the bandits, restraining them, and turning them over to law enforcement. Understood? A somewhat ragged chorus of affirmatives answered the Hokage, who nodded sharply. She plucked a manila folder from the chaos of the desk and proffered it. Sakura glanced over at Shino, who tilted his head toward the Hokage. So it was Sakura who went forward to take the folder. Weighing its weight in her hand, she suggested they adjourn somewhere else to go over the details and was met with ready agreement. The thought of facing 10 men might have made her more nervous with a different partner, but if they only suspected that they had ninja training, she had some confidence that Shino's Kikeichu would at least negate their ninjutsu. It worried her a little that they were only supposed to subdue them, but she'd crossed that bridge when they came to it. Once they'd left the tower, it was Ino who took the lead, finding them a neat little cafe whose walled courtyard offered them almost total privacy this early in the morning. Inside the folder were printed packets for each of them, Sakura and Shino's different from the others, and a handful of photographs and topographic maps of the area. They studied the information in relative silence, Ino badgering them for their orders and reciting it faultlessly back at the waiter when he appeared, until everyone had read over the data at least once. Sakura, by virtue of practice, apparently read faster than anyone else, and she'd only read it over a second time out of habit. Her memorization scores were even better than Ino's. This sounds like it might be fun, Ino offered. Well, for the three of us, at least. Tenten grinned. I have to admit, there hasn't been much call for dressing up on my team's missions before. I haven't worn a kimono since kunoichi classes though. Unless you count yukata. No worries, Ino reassured her. She flipped her long ponytail back over her shoulder with her hand in an exaggerated movement. We'll have your feminine wows up to par in no time. And Hinata-chan should be even more used to kimono than I am, right? Hinata flushed at being addressed directly and ducked her head. Yes, she answered in a small voice. If it comes to looking demure in anything, I'd take Hinata-san's advice over Ino's, Sakura confided to Tenten. Ino always managed to look one photographer short of a glamour shot whenever we did formal wear. It was the only thing our kunoichi instructors ever criticized her about. I can't decide if that was supposed to be an insult or a really backhanded compliment, Ino retorted. Hinata-chan, you do already own cosmetic contacts, don't you? Yes, the girl replied, more firmly this time. Do you have to wear them too, Ino-san? Not for the same reason you do, Ino said with a smile. I'm unlikely to be kidnapped or anything, but if I want to pass as a civilian, my eyes are kind of a dead giveaway. Sakura glanced over at Shino and asked tentatively, Do you think we'll have trouble with our end of the assignment? She'd never been close to the shinobi in the academy, finding the idea of bugs living beneath his skin too much for more than politeness, but that was before she'd watched spiders drip down out a leak in the ceiling. Sakura was far from liking them, but she was confident she wouldn't embarrass herself or him by shrieking. There should be no issues, Shino responded after a moment's consideration. Weighing their numbers and what intelligence we have on them against our collective skills, barring unexpected circumstances, we should find them only a moderate challenge. Given how closely Shino's analysis paralleled her own, she wasn't surprised to find her own confidence buoyed, though she winced at the mention of unexpected circumstances. When they dispersed to pack their own supplies, Sakura and Ino were left to walk home together, which was deeply nostalgic. Especially as Ino was clearly anticipating the mission, but away from an audience she was quieter than most people suspected. Social engineer, mood maker, trendsetter, all those things were true, but that wasn't all that she was. They walked in almost comfortable silence for a long time, but then Ino spoke. I'm glad, she told Sakura. We never really got to work together much in the academy when we started running practice scenarios, because, well, you don't want to put the first and second ranked kunoichi on the same team. And we don't really hang out anymore. I miss that, she said, tone turning wistful. Mom and Dad keep asking if we've made peace over the Uchiha, and wondering if you'll start coming over to eat again. I've tried coming to your house to ask, but you're either ignoring me or you're never home. Not ignoring you, Sakura responded. Even when we were fighting over Sasuke, I couldn't manage that. I don't think anyone could, she said slyly, which made Ino grin. I am busy and the house feels empty with Dad still gone. I do training sessions in the morning, then if I'm lucky there's a solo D rank open for me. If not, I go to the library. Kakashi-sensei is a huge fan of assigned reading, because it's like training me but without any effort on his part. Then there's this one old lady that I've been helping out in the afternoon. I was doing D ranks for her for a while, but now I just go, she admitted. What she didn't admit was the amount of time she'd spent lurking in Kakashi's apartment, while he'd been in a coma, or that the old lady was a large part of the reason she didn't want to be alone in her own home. Ino eyed her until Sakura shifted uncomfortably. You should come over once we get back, the blonde said. I know that you've seen and done things that I haven't yet, but I don't think that's a good enough reason to let you deal with it by yourself. I let you try to end our friendship once over Sasuke, and I shouldn't have done that. And I shouldn't have just let you walk away the last time, either, she remarked. You know you could always talk to my dad, if you need to talk to someone. He's super good at keeping secrets. In the job description? Sakura offered in an echo of an old joke. In the job description, Ino confirmed with a grin, but it faded quickly. You don't look like you're sleeping at all, Sakura. And trust me, your looks need all the help they can get. Sakura scoffed. I'm fine, she lied. Ino replied in the tone of the unconvinced. Right, well, I'm just going to go pack. Are really going to wear that vest with that outfit? For now. All the extra pockets might make up for the fact that it is likely the most unflattering thing I've ever worn. At least until I can afford a sealing scroll. I didn't realize how expensive they were. You're bending spacetime with chakra, Ino pointed out as she stopped at the door to her house. You think that would come cheap? Chapter 30, Chronophobia, Part 2. As Sakura walked beneath the great gates that led out from the village, she experienced a pang of anxiety, and had to master the sudden need to look back at Konoha for reassurance. Wave was an anomaly, like one of the great trees falling while you happened to be standing under it. Tragic for you, but if it happened to everyone, no one would go walking in the forest. She fretted with her new, freshly laundered chamois, gray with olive drab, and tried to convince herself that she'd met her quota of missions gone bad. She didn't really believe it, which was why she tried to anticipate what might go wrong. She had enough Kevlar cord stashed in her vest pockets to rappel down the village's walls. She'd packed extra rations and a spare canteen in her backpack. 2 canisters of a tear gas mixture were a reassuring weight in another set of vest pockets, with one of a sleeping gas solution on the other side, these with internal pressurization, and she'd thought to pack a mask and spare herself the sore throat, and she'd brought along her blunted practice kunai from the academy in an effort to comply with the subdue order without resorting entirely to hand. Her chakra-enhanced strength could make the advantages of greater height and weight nil, but while she could punch hard, her control wasn't to the point where she could trust it would be just hard enough. For now it was a matter of all in or all out, which was fine if her aim was to irreversibly rupture something. Though even her all-in didn't even begin to compare to what real chakra-enhanced strength could be like. Tsunade-sama's first temper tantrum in the practice fields had evoked a strangled kind of awe, because it looked more like the work of a natural disaster than a person. She'd handily won the concession she'd wanted from the council, at least according to the rumors that had whipped through the village. She glanced to one side as Ino gave a pleased sigh, her arms stretched high above her head, sunlight making her blonde hair shine. The girl noticed her look and grinned. Oh, come on, she inveigled. There are literally days before we arrive. That gives us plenty of time to be somber and serious later. Today the sun is shining. It's my first C-rank mission without the 2 doofuses I'd been paired with since forever, and we are being useful to our village in a way that doesn't make me feel like I'm still an academy student. She makes good points, Tenten said with a laugh. Now, if you can keep that attitude up after a day in the trees, I'll be impressed. We are taking the tree road? Not running, right? Shino turned toward her, his high collar and glasses making his expression difficult to read. For what purpose would we run? In terms of weighing energy efficiency against speed of travel, the tree road represents a stamina-forgiving mode of travel without significant loss of speed. Just asking, Tenten responded. Guy-sensei is a fiend. He makes us run everywhere. I swear, some days I think someone told him he's training a team of courier nin. That sounds awful, Hinata ventured timidly. Well, some days it is. But in the interest of fairness, I am a fantastic long-distance runner by this point. And I never have to count carbs. Lucky, Ino said in good-humored envy. But no thanks. So, to the trees, oh fearless leaders? Sakura scoffed, but Shino ignored the sarcasm. Yes. There is no reason to delay and every reason to press forward. Being in the trees didn't hinder the steady ebb and fall of conversation, though Shino contributed only rarely. Not because he didn't want to intrude or felt unwelcome, Sakura thought or at least hoped, but because he didn't have anything of note to contribute and Shino didn't do idle conversation. It was an easy 3-day trip by the tree road to their destination, which was located on the peninsula, almost on the border between Fire and Tea. On the evening of the second day, when they were approaching the area they'd tentatively identified as the thieves' territory, their squad split. Tenten, Ino, and Hinata would spend the night as civilians at a way station and continue by themselves on foot, while Sakura and Shino kept to the trees and pressed ahead. They scouted the road as they went, not willing to chance the others facing an ambush, but the roads were clear and Sakura caught her first sight of Mayako Wager, which was a large, gracious-looking inn that abutted the ocean. It wasn't a straight drop down into the waves, but rather a stepped series of rocky shelves that someone had thoughtfully carved steps into. Unwise to visit in unpleasant weather, but with today's waves only lapping contently against the lowest shelf, it was no surprise to see a yukata-clad guest staring out over the water. The height of the trees dropped sharply and changed composition as they came nearer to the ocean, but the forest never disappeared entirely, the man-made elements blending almost seamlessly into their surroundings. The titular tea flowers were blooming in profusion around the landward side of the inn where there was protection from the salt spray. All in all, it shot a bolt of envy through Sakura, who would be camping out for the duration. But then again, she reminded herself, she'd much rather be a guest than part of the staff. She'd never had any natural grace at most of the kunoichi classes, Ikebana memorably included, though through hard work and Ino's assistance, and that of Ino's mother, she'd mustered sufficient skill to see them through. She shoved away the thought that serving guests didn't normally include being involved in a fight weighted against her in terms of numbers, concentrating instead on how terrified she'd always been when she'd had to mind her sleeves and stride length aside from whatever task she'd been asked to do. Though they didn't have any reason to believe that the inn was under active surveillance, Gion-san might have paid for their services, but the attacks had focused on the roads. Shino swept the grounds with his beetles. Sakura tried to avoid staring or averting her eyes as the insects crawled up the backs of Shino's hands to disappear inside his sleeves, but her mind was attempting mathematics of the unnerving kind as it tried to calculate how many beetles could reasonably be concealed by Shino's heavy clothing. A lot, came the answer, but she stopped that line of thought when she started imagining she could hear the rustle of their movement and the clatter of tiny mandibles. Genjutsu came in two forms, invocative and evocative. To be truly good at the first, Guzen-san insisted, you need an imagination with an eye for detail. Which was well and good, Sakura reflected darkly, until you found that you were scaring yourself silly. She came out of her thoughts to find Shino staring at her, and she flushed. There appeared to be no hidden watchers, he reported. We should make contact with Gion-san. Yeah, Sakura replied awkwardly, letting him take the lead as they made for Gion-san's office. The interview with the client that followed was brisk and professional, the lady just as elegant as her house, and she had kunoichi class composure. She'd given them fuller details on the attacks, and when Shino had left to suss out the best locations for their daytime posts, she worked with Sakura in identifying the precise location of the attacks on their topography map. When Sakura left with just as much care as she'd taken coming in, she had a moment's anxiety before Shino dropped down from a nearby tree. The males can follow the pheromone trails of a female, he explained at her unspoken question, adjusting his sunglasses on the bridge of his nose. I planted one on you earlier. I did not ask your permission. Why? Because I thought you might be irrationally upset. My observations in the past revealed an unfounded fear of insects common among females, though perhaps preferable to the male response which uses violence to cover a similar unease. Sakura frowned at him. I'm more upset at not being asked than the beetle. I'm not in any danger of squishing her by accident, am I? She perceives and processes visual information 3 times faster than the human brain, so that significantly reduces your chances of crushing her, Shino reassured her. Judging by the behavior of the males, she's in the folds of your scarf, just behind your right ear. Just so long as little insect feet are far from bare skin, Sakura said, ignoring the instinctive EW factor, noticing only now the pinky nail-sized beetles tracing patterns in the air near her head. I haven't completely mastered my involuntary sweat reflex. Shino nodded gravely. Understood. He led her to the sites he'd scouted and they settled in after they briefly visited the site of the most recent attack. They discovered it wasn't incompetence on the part of the local police, who tried to use dogs. A recent rain in the area combined with basic track concealment skills meant there wasn't much to go on as their targets had sufficient ninja skill to travel by the tree road. Shino directed swarms of 12 beetles each to settle in the footpaths, road, and among the branches of some of the likely trees. They'd return immediately if they were disturbed, or that was his explanation of what he was doing when he caught Sakura staring. As he'd been completely silent, doing nothing more than staring intently at his hands, which had been covered in beetles, she was more than a little unnerved. Carrying out instructions that complex was more credit than she'd given to Shino's swarm. Living proximity traps that would escape the notice of all but the most observant, she could see how that might be very useful skill to have on a team like his. For her part, she studied their newly embellished map and spent the afternoon establishing a search area. Ideally there would be another incident, and they would have a fresh trail. Otherwise they were going to attempt to follow that thoroughly sketchy trail, and would need all the assistance they could get. She was tucked close to the trunk of a tree, her chamois tied over her distinctive hair, when the other three girls made their appearance. All three had changed into casual civvies and took the time to really admire Mayako Wazier, Ino's voice drifting up to her perch. Another strike of envy, this one harder to shove away. But she did, eventually, one hand coming up to sweep her fingers along the slick raised ridge of her latest scar. Next week she saw the specialist again. Shino was different from both of her teammates. He hardly even shifted for hours at a time, but whereas Sasuke probably wouldn't have initiated conversation if they'd waited a week, on their second day she found him in her tree. His attempt at conversation was awkward. And Sakura finally understood after knowing him for the better part of a decade that his speech habit of asking questions and answering himself was at least partially a nervous tell. He wasn't like Naruto, who could natter on forever, or Ino, who could conjure conversational topics. He was instead bluntly interested in how much she'd changed from the academy and the experiences and training that had caused it. The way he phrased it made it seem less like a personal interest than a kind of scientific curiosity, as if he'd identified a kind of caterpillar only to be surprised at what emerged from the cocoon. No matter why he wanted to know, Sakura wasn't about to share. She tried to be polite, but she was afraid all her words had slightly jagged edges. So she was therefore very surprised when he tried to use a very basic tactic, reciprocity, to draw it out of her. They were 3 days and without so much as news of the bandits, though they were going to give it one more day. According to the pattern, they were almost overdue for another attack. By this point, Sakura was immensely tired of waiting in trees for something to happen and was on the verge of thinking that perhaps Kakashi-sensei's bring-a-book mentality wasn't far off the mark. Not porn, though. She was nowhere near that desperate for entertainment. The speculation that all my beetles dwell inside my body is erroneous, Shino commented, which tore her out of contemplating how uncomfortable tree branches were as prolonged seeding. Only the females nest inside my body, which causes the males to swarm. If you were to attempt to host an entire colony, even a small one, your muscle structure would be so compromised as to be non-functional. As it is, space inside the abdominal cavity is limited, which creates a limit on how many beetles I can host. Much of my physical training is devoted to improving my core strength, so that my abdominal wall provides sufficient protection. Sakura half turned to glance at him, but as he was on the opposite side of the trunk, she could only see the edge of one sleeve. Like bees? She ventured. No. You're thinking of worker bees, which are non-reproductive females except in exceptional circumstances when a hive becomes queenless. The females are more intelligent, and they do coordinate the males, so not an unreasonable comparison, but it has significant shortcomings in understanding the social structure of a Kakashi swarm. Sakura made a thoughtful noise in the back of her throat. Wouldn't this be considered an Abdurrahim clan secret? No. This would be clear upon close observation to anyone with reasonable deductive skills. Making the symbiosis functional and breeding the Kakashi to possess desired traits would be considered secret. Something has disturbed several of the tree road swarms, he said, shifting instantly back into a professional mien. Sakura tensed but didn't move to look immediately, the human eye fixed on movement quicker than it did shape. She saw the flight of beetles returning and very slowly shifted so that she could catch glimpses of bodies moving through the trees. She could hear them too, which was reassuring as a measure of their skill level. When they were well past, Shino and she slunk closer to Mayako Wazier. Laid out along the length of a branch, Shino somewhere below her, Sakura got her first decent glimpse of their targets through her field glasses. Judging by their silhouettes, they were all male, and slighter of build than she'd expected. Young? Her mind posited. That might make sense. Dissatisfied young men who didn't have the skill to be promoted but had plenty of skill to terrorize civilians. Even Konohagakure lost track of a few genin, and would be genin each year, a number that had spiked exponentially in the wake of the invasion. She couldn't confirm her guess as to their age, because they all wore grinning oni masks that only exposed their faces below the nose. Her grip tightened as she saw Gion-san exit the inn to greet her guests, trailed by 3 familiar fellow genin. They trust you to do your job, Sakura reminded herself, now trust them to do theirs. Hinata put on the most convincing show of being cowed, but she did it almost too well. One of the bandits strutted up to her, tugging at her bangs hard enough to make the blue-haired girl wince. Ino's nature wouldn't let that pass without comment, which earned her a hard backhand, but one of the men, the leader, snapped something at the man who'd struck her. He stepped away, though the one who was speaking to Hinata stepped closer to her, and said something that made the girl blush ferociously. And then they were inside, and Sakura could only wait and hope that nothing went wrong inside, because her mission was very clear. She felt the branch she was on shift, and turned her gaze away from the view provided by her field glasses to find Shino crouched just behind her feet. Here, he murmured, pulled something from one of the cavernous pockets of his jacket. With another glance toward the inn, Sakura let her feet drop to either side of the branch and shoved herself upright. Tucking her field glasses pack into her pouch, she reached out to accept what he offered. "Zip ties?" she whispered back. "With a flexible metal core," Shino confirmed. "Why?" "Because it requires metal snips to remove, making escape unlikely. My mother specializes in live retrieval." "Thanks," Sakura said, surprised by the gesture, but Shino had already dropped back to his branch. Sakura tucked away the handful of zip ties, which fit awkwardly into her own pockets. Each of them had taken one quick bathroom break by the time the bandits emerged, which left them immediately prepared to follow. Shino's females had positioned themselves near the inn's exits, which made it an easy task for them to drop unnoticed onto the bandits' clothing. They waited until there was a sufficient distance for stealth, and then Shino led the way. It was a longer journey than Sakura had anticipated, almost on the edge of the search grid she'd established. There were no recorded cave systems in the area and no houses, so they were surprised to see that the entire group slipped inside an almost invisible crevice that looked like nothing so much as an elongated natural sinkhole. Once inside, they were equally astonished to find a vast, linked series of rooms the size of a warehouse. "What is this place?" Sakura asked so softly that she doubted Shino would hear. But he did. "They say that during the Third War," he murmured, "they had Doton users create a series of hidden fortifications all throughout the Land of Fire. The location is odd, but perhaps this is one of them. When the war ended, no record of their locations were ever made public. And likely they didn't find it necessary to maintain the ones in non-critical positions." And then there was no more conversation as they traversed the ceilings, hearing the conversation of the bandits from the third chamber of the complex. Sakura retrieved one of her canisters from her vest, but Shino's hand descended on her wrist. There was just enough light to make out him shaking his head, and she realized that in chambers like these, with unknown and likely limited ventilation, her partner wouldn't be able to provide support. But that wasn't what he had in mind, she discovered as he inched closer. "Let me secure the room with the swarm first," he murmured. "They can prevent escape and hasten the collapse of our targets." Sakura nodded and couldn't help a shiver as her closeness allowed her to feel when Shino's swarm poured from sleeves and pockets, a huge mass of softly rustling elytron that swept like an ominous cloud into the next room. She waited patiently for Shino's signal, securing her gas mask and combat glasses, sealing the second. Her sleeping gas mixture was isoflurane-based, the cheapest and most generally available inhalational anesthetic except for the flammable ethers that were still fairly popular for situations that carried less of a risk of sparks. Though that might have seen a quick end to the bandit problem, even if it made her stomach twinge at the thought. She didn't expect it to actually put anyone to sleep. If she increased the concentration or if the room was significantly smaller than this one, she was running the risk of outright death on the part of the bandits because the invention of a safe sleeping solution was something that would make someone's fortune. But she did expect it to significantly relax muscles and reduce reaction time. When Shino's signal came, her reaction was instant, pitching in the canister and herself only seconds later. One hand swept to a blunted kunai while she kept the other one free, and the following minutes were a blur of limbs and weapons in action. They weren't good enough to sell their skill as mercenaries, for all their having learned to hide their trail. That was Sakura's first irreverent thought as her opponents tried to combat both gas and a winged enemy that was feasting on their chakra, leaving them with only sluggish weapon and hand-to-hand skills. It was the first mission in which Sakura felt that the Academy's training was more than adequate, though it was tricky to navigate through the sheer number of opponents. The blunted kunai disappeared from use as she used both hands to fix zip ties on a downed opponent, shifting to avoid the clumsy strikes of another bandit, whose hand she caught and secured in the instant after the first was secured. It was a pattern that continued until all of the bandits were captured, though the shallow, erratic breathing of a few of them were enough to make her nervous. All that remained was for them to do after that was to send for the police, Shino sprinting off while Sakura used her chakra-enhanced strength to get the men up out of the bunker, their spoils following them up by the time the local authorities had arrived to take custody of them. At least 2 required immediately medical attention, but Sakura's guilt was tempered by the knowledge that part of the responsibility lay with Shino's chakra-hungry beetles and the irrefutable fact that it had been the easiest, quickest, cleanest way to deal with the problem. She wouldn't even have any new facial scars to show for it, though one lucky bandit had opened up a long gash on her arm. They reported their success to Gyeon-san, who rewarded them with a fantastic dinner and a night at Mayako Asia. Sakura had a chance to tease Ino, who was obviously eyeing a handsome blue-haired apprentice chef, and enjoy a long, relaxing bath. By the time she woke the next morning, in a clean, fluffy futon which smelt like fresh herbs, she was almost giddy with the success of the whole thing. All the bandits had survived the night, no one had gotten badly hurt, even if Ino had bruised, and she had a commemorative photo that featured the 4 girls in yukata around the table spread with a course of their kaiseki dinner, 2 on either side of the coat-clad aburame. That feeling of triumph buoyed her all the way back to Konoha, where they delivered their report directly to a grim-faced Tsunade-sama. When she dismissed the others, asking Sakura to stay behind, the frisson of unease that had prickled the back of Sakura's neck when they'd been directed to the office of the Hokage transmuted to a full-body chill. Yesterday, Uchiha Sasuke defected to Otogekure. Chapter 31, Chronophobia, Part 3. I don't understand, Sakura forced through lips that felt as if they'd gone numb. Tsunade-sama interlaced her fingers and rested her chin on them. When Orochimaru approached your teammate, he was flagged as a flight risk. Given his Kekkei Genkai, a high-priority one. At the Genin level and even in some Chunin specializations, there are officially recognized methods of transferring your citizenship to another village. In Konohagakure, that includes an interview with a Yamanaka to determine just how much sensitive information you intend to take with you. Jounin are ineligible for this, and there are some Kekkei Genkai we cannot allow to leave this village. The Sharingan is obviously one of them. The Chunin assigned to that particular patrol district had instructions to check the Uchiha's home and verify his presence. Toward dawn, they found him absent and his mission gear missing. At that point, I had 2 options. Send a proper retrieval team to return him to the village no matter his feelings on the matter, or send a group of his age mates in an effort to convince him to return of his own accord. I am aware of how Orochimaru works, she told Sakura with just a hint of wryness. He is very good at sowing confusion, doubt, and using just the right touch of physical force to manipulate a situation. In the long term, dragging the Uchiha home would have fed into any persecution complex that Orochimaru erected. So I gambled on getting his willing cooperation. And lost, Tsunade-sama admitted gravely. I underestimated how badly Orochimaru wanted him. Usually, making it to him is a test in itself. If you can't make it to him, you aren't worth his time. There was a distant, reflective look in Tsunade-sama's eyes. That's just the way he's always been. But this time he sent retrieval teams. If there'd been fewer of your age mates, or if they'd been less skilled, it could have been a disaster. As it was, no one died, but Uchiha Sasuke belongs to Otogekure now. This was yesterday? Sakura asked, her voice strange and quivery. Because she remembered yesterday, all pretty clothes, delicious food, and the uninterrupted view of the ocean. Yes, Tsunade-sama confirmed. You'll need to do an interview. Inoichi-san has volunteered to conduct it himself. If you were aware of his intentions, helping to conceal them is a crime against the village. Sakura shook her head slowly. I knew he was unhappy, she whispered. And I saw. Her hand traveled up to clutch at her neck where Sasuke's seal had lain quiescent. She swallowed. I was there, when he met Orochimaru. I still didn't think. I don't understand why he joined him. Tsunade-sama only gave her a bitter, twisted smile and dismissed her to her interview with Ino's father. When that was over, Sakura plodded to the hospital, her eyes fixed on her feet. She'd expected her thoughts to be loud and tangled, but they were silent and still. Sasuke was gone, that was the one thing that mattered. For all that he made her uncomfortable and afraid, he loomed so large in her life until these past few months that thinking of living without him was like contemplating life without the sun rising in the morning. She stood for long minutes outside the room with the placard for Uzumaki Naruto, sharply reminded of the last time she'd come to visit a teammate in the hospital. Was that fight part of the reason he'd left? She couldn't wrap her mind around that idea. Orochimaru had said he'd come to him seeking power, but hadn't that fight showcased plenty of it? Sasuke's Chidori, Naruto's Rasengan. If you weighed one against the other, they would both kill a human just as dead, for all that one left a bigger impact crater. And she'd been promoted to Chunin in her first year out of the academy. Team 7 had been poised to become the most powerful combat squad of their generation. Even if Sasuke had taken it in his head to go hunting Itachi, her deductive reasoning skills were intact enough to realize that once she'd swallowed the uncomfortable fact that Sasuke's stated life goal was murder, their team was powerful and capable. Though the village might never have authorized a mission against Uchiha Itachi, they would have followed Sasuke. She could see it in her mind's eye, using village intel to establish a search area, taking just enough leave to accomplish the mission, a hunt made swift by the Nikken. That was all so many shattered ideals now, she recognized as she slid the door open. I tried to bring him back, Naruto burst out the moment he recognized who'd stepped into the room. I did, he protested before she could say anything, hands clenched tight on his cover. I know, she replied simply, which made some of the wildness fade from his eyes. You do? He blurted. Sakura frowned at him as she made way to a chair, scooting it next to Naruto's bed. What kind of person was she in Naruto's eyes? Yes. Tsunade-sama and Ino's father explained. Naruto nodded slowly, then his eyes fell to his hands and stayed there. I'm sorry I couldn't bring him back for you, Sakura-chan, he told her. It was Sasuke who chose to leave, Sakura replied. Saying it was almost painful, like chewing needles, but the truth was like that sometimes. Guzen-san had shown her that, told her that sometimes it was like trying to drink a cup full to overflowing with fire ants, difficult and bitter to swallow. She glanced up from her contemplation of her own hands to find Naruto staring at her. You're not mad at me? What right do I have to be mad when I wasn't even here? Sakura asked him bitterly. It was Naruto's turn to develop a perplexed wrinkle in his brow. How would you know to be here? Did he tell you he was going to pull a dumbass stunt like this? Sakura struggled to find the right words to express something that sounded stupid even as it coalesced. I just should have known. If you love someone, you're supposed to be able to tell if they're about to turn traitor. Or at least you'd think so. Sasuke never told me anything, she finished softly, betrayal rippling like a sour note in a symphony through her words. Well, I like you, Sakura-chan, and I thought you'd be yelling by now, so I guess we don't get everything right, Naruto offered gamely, though his grin was crooked. I never understood that either, Sakura admitted. I've never been nice to you, Naruto. That crooked grin faltered and then fell away entirely. I guess not. But you were polite when we first met. Not nice, I guess, but you treated me exactly the same as the rest of the class. Later, when you were annoyed at me, I could tell it was me annoying you, not that weird scum on my shoe thing that everyone else was doing even when I hadn't done anything to them. That I knew of, he clarified, his expression so soberly thoughtful that it was almost like looking at a stranger. Then he grinned again, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. And you're cute. That earned a weak smile. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but you can do much, much better than someone who's genuinely annoyed by you, Sakura replied. I won't ever find pranks that cause property damage funny or think that breaking the rules and getting promoted to the next class regardless is something daring instead of irritating. But the world is full of people. Ones we haven't even met yet, as my mother keeps telling me. I am your teammate, Naruto. Maybe, one day, we'll be friends. But I don't think I'll ever like you. Naruto grimaced. I guess I knew that. And your mom was right, you know. There are plenty of other pretty boys that aren't grade A assholes. I guess. Somewhere. I can't believe we're having this conversation, Sakura said with a wobbly laugh, the first warmth of tears blooming behind her eyes. Naruto nodded, his own eyes suspiciously watery. You're really not mad? He asked tentatively. I'm really not much of anything. Mostly sad, a little convinced that this is just another nightmare. Angry will come later, I guess. But you almost killed yourself trying to bring Sasuke back. Naruto visibly hesitated, then glanced up at the door. Not that you can tell, he told her, voice tempered with his own bitterness. They'll discharge me this afternoon. About the forest of death, I'm sorry. What do you mean? His hands were clenched in his covers again. It just seems stupid now, but it wasn't like anybody ever got really hurt during training at the academy. I just thought it was like that for everyone. It hurts, and you suck it up until it doesn't anymore. Here, look at my hand, he said, thrusting it toward her. Glancing up at him from beneath raised brows, Sakura did as he asked. What am I looking for? She asked at last, finding it unremarkable. It looked the way a hand ought to look, but then it dawned on her what she wasn't seeing. This is the hand you stabbed, isn't it, back on the way to Wave? They removed your scarring? Tight-lipped, Naruto only looked at her expectantly, so she reached forward and ran questing fingers along skin so smooth that Ino would have had a fit of jealousy. You don't have any scars, she remarked in surprise. Not even the tiny ones that accumulated from a lifetime's handling of weapons, no matter how careful you tried to be. And you hardly have weapon calluses. See? Naruto said. That's what I didn't realize back in the forest. I didn't start putting it together until I saw how long it took you to heal and how bad your scarring was. I don't heal like you do, so I don't hurt like you do. Sorry, Sakura-chan. I didn't know. Sakura just sort of gaped at him, but then she forced her jaw shut, her thumb stroking over unscarred knuckles one last time before her hand retreated to her lap. So you have some sort of regenerative bloodline? Something like that, Naruto muttered. Sakura searched for a word useful. That's it? Naruto demanded. Just that's useful? It also makes me feel even less guilt about hitting you upside the head, which pretty much puts it in the negative, Sakura informed his irritably, gritting her teeth only slightly as she tried to keep her temper in check. I have lived my entire life surrounded by classmates who have abilities I won't ever have, just because they happen to be born into the right clan. My family has served, fought, died, and passed unremembered into history from the founding. When I was younger and when I was still having a hard time at the academy, it used to make me angry enough to say terrible things to my parents and my grandmother, she confessed grimly. I blamed them for being perfectly unremarkable people. That changed? Naruto questioned softly, probably wary of Sakura's temper. When she was dying, my grandmother told me that it was an opportunity. That whatever I made of myself, I wouldn't have to live in the shadow of my clan's name. My name would be my own, my achievements my own, and that I could pass that legacy forward, until there was some child far in the future wondering how she'd ever measure up to her ancestress. I didn't really believe her, but it made me realize that I didn't want to live my whole life dogged by jealousy. It was only making me miserable, because it was something no amount of wishing could change. So yes, it's useful, like the Byakugan, the Sharingan, or any of the secret clan jutsu. Her tone was slightly snappish, because for all her speech and best intentions, it was difficult to be generous when faced with things you couldn't have. She was trying though, sometimes it was the effort that mattered. She was rewarded by a sheepish grin. Yeah, I guess so, Naruto conceded. I just wanted to prove them all wrong, that I would amount to something no matter what they said about me, and I didn't need any fancy clan name to do it with. Well, Sakura replied sheepishly, it did help that I consistently ranked in the top 3 of our class. Naruto snorted. Yeah, he said again. Then, more softly, yeah? Sakura-chan? Yes? You know, after this, when I'm released from the hospital, Jiraiya wants to take me out of the village. For training. You don't want to go? Naruto shrugged. Granny Tsunade already said she's not going to send more ninja after Sasuke. And the Arrow Sennin didn't sound like it was really a choice. He's mostly an idiot and a pervert, but I guess that you can't really say he doesn't deserve to be part of the Sannin. But with both me and Sasuke away, what will happen to you? It was her turn to echo the gesture. I'm Chunin Naruto. There'll be missions. Composite teams, like the last one I was on. She bit her lip and swiped hastily at a tear that spilled down her cheek. Hey, Naruto said, leaning forward and catching at her hand, we'll get him back. I promise. Everything about his body language told her that he was in earnest, that he really believed in what he was saying. If all it took was dragging him home, Tsunade-sama would have sent a jounin to do it, she whispered, arresting the path of more tears. He comes back and then what, Naruto? We can bring him back to the village, but only Sasuke can decide to stay. His grip tightened on her hand, and in that moment was a silent understanding that Naruto would try regardless. Chapter 32, Toward Better Days, Part 1. Storage. With Sasuke gone and Naruto now absent on his training journey, Sakura lived in a perpetual state of nervous anticipation for all that she'd acted blasé in front of Naruto. The missions were a certainty. Her relationship with Kakashi-sensei was far more uncertain. It wasn't unheard of for jounin to take on individual apprentices, but there was a special process for that. Sakura didn't have any illusions of being so specially gifted as to merit the complete attentions of a jounin as storied as Kakashi-sensei even under normal circumstances. Nor was she skilled enough to not be a serious liability on the kind of missions he'd need to take on now that Konohagakure needed the kind of income A-rank missions brought. And she was, after all, Chunin. Technically speaking, she was a working ninja now. What she learned would be from her seniors, not from a teacher. It was entirely possible that they'd only place her with a more experienced team, and that would be the end of it. Team 7 would become nothing more than a memory of failure. She hardly ever slept in her bed anymore. The Western-style piece of furniture was too much sacrifice on altar for the abused limits of her imagination, but it was still her favorite place to think, especially when there was sunlight spilling in through her window, warm as an embrace. Her knees were pulled tight to her chest, back supported by the wall, and her forehead pressed to one of her knees. Even though the time she'd haunted Kakashi-sensei's apartment had been very brief, she missed it terribly. With 8 dogs, there was always someone begging attention, or food, or just proving remarkably tolerant of intermittent petting. Not like here, where the emptiness of the house below seemed almost to echo, her thoughts too loud and too uninterrupted to prevent the slow encroach of a miserable depression. Kakashi's couch might have been a nightmare, likely older than she was and with an almost magnetic property where dog hair was concerned, but she'd trade that perch in an instant with her tidy bed and all her sunlight. She hadn't seen any of them, Sensei or Niken, since he'd left on his last mission. Sakura tightened her grip, pressing her head harder against her knees. She needed to stop this and she knew it, but she wasn't any more able to stop the first trickle of tears than she would have been able to hold back the tide. It was worse than not having teammates, worse than being just the one left behind. One of them was a traitor. She was still struggling with the idea, but others didn't have the same conflicted feelings. Today, a woman on the street, a perfect stranger, cheeks flushed with rage, eyes full of unshed tears, had come to a dead stop right in front of her and hissed, "I hope that your former teammate gets everything he deserves. My brother died when that snake came, and then that boy." The word was so full of rancor it could have been a curse. Just hands Orochimaru the most valuable bloodline this village has. It was only the opening salvo of a stream of potent vitriol, and Sakura had been powerless to do anything but stand there, pale-faced and trembling, as she closed her eyes and wished she could just flee. But some part of her brain had recognized that since Sasuke's defection wasn't a secret any longer, this was just the first of these conversations. Somehow Gaara, who wasn't only a Jinchuriki, but also the son of the previous Kazekage, had gotten embroiled in the whole thing, and the genin who'd been sent in Sasuke's retrieval had belonged to large and prominent clans. Their families had been more than a little curious about what had hospitalized so many young prodigies, especially as they hadn't been informed that they were about to be sent out on a mission. With that many people involved, and enough shinobi more than capable of noticing when Uchiha Sasuke never showed his face on the streets again, the news spreading was only a matter of time. Tsunade-sama had taken preemptive action and announced it very gravely herself. Once she'd been so, so proud to be part of Sasuke's team. She'd gloated about it to Ino. Now she almost wished she'd been assigned to some other squad, that she'd only ever watched him at a distance, and had her heart broken at a distance too. Eventually, someone had taken pity on the young genin, gently steering the now shouting woman away. Sakura had fled at the speed of Shunshin. She was so busy trying to stop the tears, she almost didn't notice the shift of the mattress. But almost was not the same as not, and she glanced up sharply to find that it was Kakashi-sensei perched on the edge of her bed. His brow quirked in a question, but Sakura only ducked her head, trying to wipe away the evidence of her fit of tears. So she had no forewarning, only recognized the press of warm fur as Bull's weight was significant enough to tip her forward into the wave of dogs who leaped up onto the bed and were competing for space to press cool noses against her bare skin. There was no speaking, just a rather embarrassing bit of strangled snuffling on her part, but soon they teased her out of the worst of her misery, especially when Shiba started assisting by lapping at the tear tracks down her cheeks. "Thanks, everyone," she murmured, answered immediately by a unanimous tail wagging. "No problem, Sakura," Pakken reassured her. "It's the obligation of leading men to show up at times like these." She blinked at him, then turned a questioning look to Kakashi-sensei, who told her, "In this case, Pakken is your leading man. I was going to at least take a shower first." Pakken scoffed, but only grumbled something about the smell of sweat, steel, and knife oil that she couldn't quite make out. Sakura ran thumb and forefinger over Pakken's velvety soft ears. "It was an honor to learn from you, Kakashi-sensei. I wish it could have lasted longer." She hadn't thought to say it after she'd first made Chunin, too busy trying to wrap her head around the idea that she'd made Chunin at all, but the sentiment would have been just as earnest then. Kakashi-sensei might never have been there when she felt like she needed him most, but he was always there to pick up the pieces and help her glue them back together into something stronger. "Just for that comment, you should expect an extra 20 minutes on tomorrow's walk," was Kakashi-sensei's immediate reply. Sakura blinked at him. But without Sasuke and Naruto, without the team, Chunin and Jounin hardly ever worked together. "Lots of people manage friendships without being on the same team," Kakashi-sensei pointed out dryly. "And Jounin work in pairs." Clythrophobia. "If you have to go to the bathroom, go, otherwise quit squirming and ask," was Guzan-san's exasperated comment as Sakura scrubbed at the planks of the porch. Konohagakure might not have vicious extremes in weather, but mold was a year-long problem. The plan was to scrub the porch free of mold and reseal the boards, which was straightforward, but less straightforward was her reaction to Guzan-san's silence on Sasuke. Sakura bit her lip and pressed harder on her brush, using her body weight to drive the bristles deep in the worn boards. "Could you use genjutsu to brainwash someone?" she asked. "Or a seal?" "Brainwashing, you say? That would be a technique and a half," Guzan-san said with a chuckle. "And if it existed, it would be a Kekkai Genkai, and the family would be slaughtered as soon as could be managed. The rest of us make do well enough without something like that. With time and the right resources, you don't need genjutsu to change someone's mind. There wouldn't be spies in the world if it wasn't possible to turn people into assets. It's an art, almost like a really good massage. Once you know the stress points, it's just a matter of applying enough pressure. Still, you can't exploit what isn't there. There's a good deal of skill involved in picking your target, of knowing who will bend, who will break, and who will simply take you, if you are not careful. The best never even bother to lie, you just have to show them a different kind of truth. I assume this is related to your Uchiha brat. You've never showed an interest in coercion techniques before." "I actually thought you'd say something," Sakura admitted. "I have said something. Not to you, no, because I believe that when you speak, it should do something useful. In my capacity as a former ANBU captain, I submitted a recommendation to the Hokage that the Uchiha be eliminated before he grows up to be more than a nuisance." Sakura took a long moment to gape at Guzan-san, whose expression looked as if she'd done no more than recommend a particular recipe or something equally mundane, not just admitted she thought that outright killing Sasuke was the best solution. Some part of her mind finally ventured, this is her mundane. Another, far more melancholy part recognized, this is my mundane, one day. But not today, she thought fiercely. Today, she was allowed to be a little bit horrified at the comfortable finality of Guzan-san's assessment. She almost didn't notice the heat at first, radiating up from the porch planks, because her eyes were on Guzan-san, who was seated in that single rocking chair, moved to the far side of the porch, her hands busily crocheting. But when she glanced down, little tongues of fire were licking off glowing, charred wood. Sakura made a strangled sound in her throat, but the little inhalation was full of dry air and smoke, which had her choking. During the Second War, there was a year in which we had a very nasty drought here in Konoha. Usually we have more than sufficient rain, and even if we don't, there are plenty of rivers. Not so that year. And what rivers didn't dry up, they diverted in places as far from the village as they could manage. A clever man in IWA had decided that our forest could become our pyre. We lost thousands of acres to that blaze and came closer than most people know to losing thousands of human lives. It had already crowned when we arrived. They had wind-natured shinobi both enhancing the blaze and dispersing the smoke, so it was almost too late by the time a watchtower noticed. As it was like walking into hell on earth, Guzan-san said thoughtfully. Humans are fascinated by fire, but when it becomes a beast so wildly out of your control, there is a deep, primitive part of the brain that can only react with fear. And on her last word, Sakura's world blazed. Phobia. It wasn't just that Kakashi-sensei appeared whenever he liked to continue her training, though he insisted on being treated to a meal afterwards, and he was much more expensive than Naruto. But she was almost certain that he was using his influence to put her with specific teams. Unlike her first mission, the last two she'd been on had seen her appended to established teams, and she'd had just a single day of downtime between them. She had her suspicions as to his motives. Sakura didn't have a non-combat specialization, which meant that she was going to be the muscle on any purpose-built team. And her muscle wasn't that impressive just yet, though she thought she'd done well with Shino. With a proper team, it would have mattered less. Without one, she needed both strength and utility, otherwise she'd find herself at the mercy of Konoha's needs. On the mission she just returned from, she'd been part of a 5-man squad who clearly didn't really need her, though she'd been of an age with the person they'd been hired to escort. Very putatively, she'd been the girl's body double for a few dicey stretches of road. It was their field medic who'd approached her, taken her under his wing temporarily, making conversation about the medical specialization just as the head of the Force Recon unit she'd taken the other mission with had explained about acquiring and collating data and coupling that with their resources for effective action. Sakura would readily admit that medical jutsu seemed tremendously handy. She had every intention of expanding her required reading and maybe asking Honda-san for guidance if she couldn't manage with books and animal volunteers. But when she'd come to the cold realization that Tsunade-sama's medic program required her to stay out of the thick of combat even when it wasn't a matter of protecting the client, she'd known she couldn't become a field medic. Not only did it take a special breed of cold rationality to watch your teammates take the brunt of the damage without putting all Kakashi-sensei's lectures on teamwork to good use, but she just wasn't that brave. It was strange and counterintuitive, but for her standing still, fighting only defensively, was balancing on the edge of a dangerous precipice. One little misstep would lead to the kind of retreat that had nothing to do with regrouping and everything to do with running away. Every mission was first a battle with herself. And taking that step forward, exposing herself to pain, to injury, to possible death, that was winning the battle. If she just stood, if she just watched, safe and insulated in her role, she knew there would come a point where she wouldn't be able to take field missions at all. The fear would win, complacence having eroded the fear of shame, the pride and the patriotism that let her move forward despite it all. When you only watched the backs of others, she thought it would be very easy to think no one would notice. It might start small. Less eager to rush in, slower to take chances. Until it became no one would notice if I didn't come at all. She was coming to know herself uncomfortably well. It wasn't a stretch anymore to imagine herself rationalizing herself right into a role far from the field. And despite how much she did not want to be there sometimes, that felt like a betrayal. Of who she couldn't say, but it was anchored as firmly in her head and her heart as the fear. She liked to think it was more than just pride, that she deeply internalized the teamwork component of Konoha, but the pride was there, the inescapable weight of other people's opinions propping it up whenever it flinched. Whatever it was, if these were Kakashi-sensei's hints about where her possible talents might lie, she was more than half convinced she was crazy for favoring force recon. In wartime, not only were they expected to perform limited recon functions deep in enemy territory, they were expected to carry out limited-scale operations without support, then vanish like shadows in sunlight. In peacetime, their specializations were extraction, hostage recovery, and kidnapping. Missions that required them to move fast, silently, and improvise. It sounded like every nightmare mission she'd ever participated in, so she hoped that time would bring other missions. Other options. Sakura was so involved in mulling over a future in which she voluntarily placed herself in that position that she was entirely surprised by the presence of someone else in the house. Treading lightly over the floorboards, she padded toward the kitchen and the soft sounds of something that she didn't actually think was a home invasion. It was more than likely just Kakashi-sensei pillaging snacks that weren't out of date at this time last year. So she wasn't prepared for the sight that greeted her. "Mom?" she gasped, remembering only belatedly that she'd known she was coming. Somewhere upstairs, there was a calendar on which the date had neatly written down, and then circled a time or 20 for good measure. Haruno Mabuki turned and her eyes widened at the sight of her daughter. Sakura was suddenly, fiercely glad that her appointment with the specialist had gone well, her face once again unscarred. She didn't even think she looked particularly bad, but of course her mother hadn't seen her for some time. And Sakura doubted it was the few poor inches she'd gained since graduation that held her attention. She realized one hand had gone to clutch at the opposite arm, the other dropping to rest comfortably atop one of her knives. It was a defensive posture, and she tried to force herself to relax it, to throw herself into her mother's arms, but it was like her feet had sprouted roots while she wasn't looking. So it was her mother who closed the distance between them, folding Sakura into her arms. The gesture brought back her childhood, carried on her mother's scent and in the safety she'd always found there. One of her mother's hands came up to cradle the back of her head, navigating her sweaty, tangled hair with ease. "Oh, Sakura," her mother breathed. "Mom," Sakura mumbled into her mother's shoulder, almost choking on all the things that needed said. But for the moment she just clung to the one woman left in the world who could make things better by just being there. Her Baba could have done the same, maybe even better, but she was long gone. Gone, 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 like her mother and father had been for most of her life, like Sasuke, like Naruto. Everyone always left her behind. She hadn't cried, not really, since she'd heard the news. But suddenly she was sobbing and couldn't bring herself to stop. "Vestiphilia," Sakura hissed as she dabbed the rubbing alcohol towelette against the wide, ragged scrapes that decorated one of her legs, deep enough that she was dribbling blood. It looked like she'd been severely underestimating the abrasiveness of tree bark all this time, but she was now thoroughly schooled in the fact that not all of Konoha's forest was as forgiving as their smooth-barked fire beaches. Mariko only watched, hands resting comfortably in the pockets of her sleeveless hoodie and looking cheerfully unrepentant. "This is why sane people wear pants," she told Sakura, voice rough with laughter. "I'm actually a little surprised that your legs don't look as if you live with a rabid house cat." Sakura took a moment from her task to scowl at the older Chunin, who'd been the one to bod-check her into a tree. That only made her grin widen, Ri's tail beating out an eager tempo against loam. "I'm just suggesting you don't ruin your best feature before you have a chance to make use of them." "Best feature?" Sakura repeated dumbly. "Sure. A cute face gets you noticed in the academy, but once you've hit puberty, eyes tend to trend elsewhere. You've already got great calves. How much do you run, seriously? But I bet you're going to have fantastic legs once you've got some height. I've met your mother, remember, so I wouldn't hold out much hope on the chest angle. Genes, you know, can't win against them. Unless you're going the path of Tsunade-sama. There is no way those things are natural, not unless she's got some children stashed away somewhere. Body fat just does not do that." "Why are we talking about this?" Sakura asked. "Girl talk," Mariko said. "Very important part of life. Right, Sakuya?" Sakuya and his teammate Chiesa, who was an unfair combination of fantastically pretty, genuinely nice underneath some tsundere speech patterns, and really skilled, none of which was lost on Sakura, had been pretending deafness from the moment Mariko had mentioned puberty. Sakura had thought Kiba was crude in school, but it turned out to be a clan-wide frankness that very probably had something to do with their canine companions. With that frankness amped up into a late-teens chunin, there had been some very uncomfortable conversational lines crossed. One of Mariko's teammates had resigned, while the other had found a non-combat specialty, leaving Mariko to head a team of chunin whose teams had been similarly dissolved. That made her a fantastic resource, someone willing to talk about practical choices and who hadn't taken the prodigy route through her career. She was also an eager sparring partner who wasn't above explaining the best ways to counter her own attacks. Best of all, unlike Kakashi-sensei, Sakura also didn't have the sensation she was allowing Sakura to have the upper hand whenever she managed to take it. But God, sometimes she was embarrassing. The last time their little coterie, Mariko, Ri, Sakura's whole team, and others who'd been in the stands during the invasion, had made it out to dinner, Sakura had thought she'd have to invent a jutsu that let her melt into her chair. Ranking the posterior assets of men wasn't a conversation she thought she could survive more than once. Sure, Sakura and Ino had giggled together over boys, but it had been more of a general thing. He's cute, he's not, maybe noticing his eyes or his hair, not a breakdown of someone's body so complete as to be a rubric for attractiveness. It had only gotten worse when she'd attempted to wrangle Sakura and the other boys into the conversation, proving either confident enough or flexible enough in her sexuality to turn her sights on women. The other chunin trended 4 to 5 years older than her. Sometimes hanging out with them made her feel special and much closer to adulthood, but sometimes she only felt tremendously awkward and out of place. As flattered as I am to be included in this girl talk, Sakura said after a long pause, white brows rising incrementally, though his voice was as smooth as ever, I think I'll choose the staying silent option. It was Mariko's turn to raise her brows. Does that mean you're coming with us when we take Sakura shopping? Hey, Sakura protested sharply, I think you skipped the step where you asked Sakura if she wanted to go shopping. One word. Pants. Bibliophilia. Sakura balked when she saw the store, but Kakashi-sensei's hand clamped down on her shoulder. Sakura-chan, he drawled, is something wrong? She tried to splutter an answer, but before she could, she found herself inside, the door closing behind them with a decidedly ominous sound. Sakura made a small, hunted eep and Kakashi-sensei's hand closed tighter. It was a lot more crowded than she'd imagined, but it only stood to reason. These people were here for the same reason that Kakashi-sensei was. After all, today was the release of the first press of the Ika Ika Paradise movie. Or at least that was what she assumed from the promotional signing. Only Kakashi-sensei's hand was serving to keep her from bolting for the door. Why don't you look around? He suggested in a voice that suggested it wasn't a suggestion at all. While you're waiting. I'm going to get in line. And with a firm pat on her shoulder, he abandoned her. Her eyes darted for the door, but she obeyed, skulking closer to the shelves so she wouldn't seem so out of place. She was very purposefully not looking at anything when a voice asked, "Can I help you find something?" Sakura nearly leapt out of her skin as she stammered, No, I'm not looking for anything." She turned to see an almost disappointingly normal clerk regarding her with faint amusement. An almost disappointingly normal female clerk, with pretty, tea-colored hair and kind brown eyes. "You're a girl," Sakura said without thinking. It almost came out as an accusation. The amusement deepened. "Strangely enough, women enjoy smut too," she said. "Though we usually demand a little more in the way of plot. We only carry a limited video line, and as books are almost the only escape from the male gaze, most of our customers are actually female when there isn't a new Ika Ika release. Is this your first time here?" "I'm not here," Sakura responded immediately. She pointed to Kakashi-sensei. "I'm here with him." The clerk, whose tag read Akemi, followed the line of her finger until she encountered Kakashi-sensei, who noticed them and waved. Cheekily. Akemi chuckled. "Ah, Hataki-san? If he's here for the release, you'll be a while. We won't be giving out copies for another 3 hours." Sakura's shoulders slumped. She'd thought Pakin's reprisals for failing training goals were bad. Now she knew better. Are you sure I can't help you find anything? Akemi asked. You're free to browse, but that can be a little dangerous if you're sensitive, she settled on after a significant pause. Sakura just stared blankly at her for a long moment, before raw curiosity triumphed over social conditioning. She had certain expectations about stores like these and the books and things in them, but this clerk defied them. So she wanted to know. What about something with a strong kunoichi? Ah, Akemi said thoughtfully. That's your taste, then? I think I can recommend something. Sakura followed her obediently, but with growing trepidation. Akemi finally came to what she was looking for, pulling from the shelf one of novels. She expected one of those damning, blandly colored slipcovers, but she was surprised to find it much like the light novel she'd borrowed from the library before Kakashi-sensei's reading assignments had taken over her life. Sakura still accepted it like she might a live snake and tried to not look too closely at the cover. Tentatively flipping it over to the title page, she was instantly transfixed by the first illustration. A kunoichi, tall, slender, elegant, but wearing the uniform of an Anbu without any salacious alterations, had a shinobi caught up easily by his collar, his feet clear of the floor, her body pressing his aggressively against the wall. She was smirking, and his face was turned aside, but a blush dusted the ridges of his cheeks. He was sleekly good-looking, all artfully tousled dark hair and pretty eyes. Though it was just the first plate, Sakura suddenly felt a wash of respect for the illustrator. The title was Tsunami Tetsundra-kun. It's the first in the series. It was meant to be a standalone novel, but it was so popular they serialized it, Akemi said. The female lead's just been promoted into ANBU and she clashes with her teammates, because for this overly convoluted reason, their squad isn't formed with a captain declared outright, and they only have a short window of opportunity to decide who gets the captaincy. You'll figure out pretty quick that Tsunami's abilities are based on Tsunade-sama's, and there are some great scenes where she uses that monstrous strength to flip the usual gender roles. You know, the ones where the man pins the women in place to finish a conversation, that sort of thing. Miko-kun there is the focus of the first one, but all the members of her team have at least one novel that focuses on their development. And the later ones that feature Ukami-kun, who's her main rival, are really good too. And it's pretty vanilla throughout the series, so it's good for a first-timer. The last word was said with a hint of laughter, and Sakura flushed. So long as you stay out of the cherry pit, you'll be fine. Pure Love's pretty popular with kunoichi, so they're separated out by citrus content. Then, for our customers' convenience, they're sorted by relationship type. See the little placards on the shelf? If you're in a yuri mood and don't want to wade through the heteronormative sea, or if you can't stand yoi, you'll find it much quicker and won't be in for any unpleasant surprises in the last 20 pages. Then they're sorted by author's last name, of course. She led Sakura back to the end of the shelf, which was papered with a light green gingham and featured an anthropomorphized lime grinning at them. Other shelves kept to the cute gingham prints and big-eyed fruit, which explained why the store was called Lemon and Lime. The enormous ones over the registers had the byline "It's Doki Doki Time." The cherry pit she'd referred to was a walled-off section where a staff member stood sentry. It had not one but two anthropomorphized fruit. The bitter cherry section was apparently to the left, the dark burgundy fruit equipped with smoldering gaze, while sweet cherry was on the right, far more playful-looking. It was apparently the home of the entire Ika Ika series. Her first instinct was to thrust the book back on the shelf and pretend she'd never seen it. But Hataki-san has an account here, Akemi said with a grin. I'd say he owes you one. And we have a little reading cafe, just beyond the registers there. I recommend the orange dreamsicle float. Sakura's first instinct was a no thanks, but somehow she found herself in ownership of the novel. And by the time Kakashi-sensei had emerged, she had every intention of owning all of them. And in this way, a new fan was born. Chapter 33, Toward Better Days, Part 2. Sakura had a growing box of shame stashed beneath her bed, though her parents were gone again, and her Tsunami novels weren't half as shameful as Kakashi-sensei's Ika Ika series. Tsunami hadn't so much as kissed Nico-kun, Hibi-kun, or Usagi-kun in the 3 books she'd read, but the sheer tension was enough to leave her blushing. And quite enough to assure that outside Lemon and Lime, she didn't read them outside the privacy of her own room. That third novel had been a consolation prize to herself after a disastrous 3-week mission. A sunny southern isle, full to bursting with plant and animal life. It should have been pleasant, but whether it was the fault of bug or bacteria, Sakura had spent most of the mission very sick. The kind of sick that involved haunting a bathroom for days on end. By the time she'd come home, she'd lost almost 7 pounds. As it turned out, regardless of her former thoughts on dieting, it wasn't weight she needed to lose. The only redeeming point in the whole mess had come near the end. While the team she'd been appended to had been completing the actual mission, they'd been hired to protect a building site from criminals the islanders had been exiling into the forests for years, who'd finally overcome their differences long enough to raid the supplies for a temple restoration that it had taken the entire village almost a decade to gather the money to fund. She'd gotten several very hands-on lessons about the use of a blowgun. Using poison darts to hunt monkeys in the trees might be a practical method of hunting on the island, but she'd seen the utility of it for wider applications. Once she'd come home, she'd found a synthetic version that could be unscrewed into short sections, and Sakura-san had found her a pouch that sat horizontally at her belt line. Unlike Samban, a blowgun could be used in almost complete stillness to the same effect. And since Fu had first introduced her to poison, she'd discovered that the world was a far more inimical place than even her academy classes would have had her believe. Something as harmless seeming as a grub could be used to kill if it happened to be the progeny of a Diamphidia beetle. Not that she'd choose that particular one, because that particular toxin took its time and ended in fever delirium. Local frogs had provided the toxins to kill the monkeys she'd helped hunt. Almost half of the flowers that resided in Ino's mother's shop had some sort of toxic component. Judging by her reading, every second animal and third plant in Suna was in some way toxic. It was almost mind-boggling, but it was for the moment her light educational reading. Her serious reading involved the introductory texts of the Medicine course. It hadn't exactly been difficult to discover what the training curriculum was, and while the books had been expensive, her mother had been more than pleased to purchase the textbooks for her before leaving again. For Sakura's birthday, she'd said, and Sakura had silently accepted the fact that her mother wouldn't be home for it. She still hadn't seen her father since her promotion, which wasn't to say he hadn't been back to Konoha. Their missions weren't allowing them overlapping days at home. He'd resorted to leaving her notes, posted all around the house, on the cabinets in the kitchen, on the bathroom mirror, once a whole conversation's worth of text around the frame of her door. It had been work being equally clever and responding to them. But it was nice, the silliness, because while the academy curriculum had been easy enough that Sakura hadn't needed to really apply herself, she'd spent more time admiring Sasuke than reading their handouts, and still managed the highest scores in written work. The medical jutsu was challenging even in the groundwork stages. A good kind of challenge, though. Safe, relaxing, almost. Compared to what she put her body through physically, and what Guzen-san did to her emotionally, it was reassuring to be naturally good at something again. Only time would tell if she would feel the same way once she moved on from endless memorization and chakra exercises to actually attempting the techniques. Agoraphobia. Sakura wasn't quite certain why Guzen-san owned a half-dozen futons, as she never had any guests, but the woman made her air them out regularly and refreshed the sachets of dried herbs that kept all the drawers and closets of the house sweet-smelling. So far, the futons hadn't spewed out bugs or burst into flames or had a texture not unlike stroking nettles, so Sakura was uneasy. And apparently that was easy to read from her expression, because Guzen-san chuckled as she came even with Sakura, her arms full of herbs that had come out of her garden and had been carefully dried on her porch. Ah, the look on your face. Sometimes it isn't the illusion, it's the expectation of it that's important. The right mood, she said with a small, quirked smile. You know there are 2 types of genjutsu. Invocative, which you control, and evocative, which you draw from the mind of your victim. Your Magen, Narakumi no Jutsu, is of the latter type. It's gentle enough, as those things go. Once, when we were in the field and didn't have a Yamanaka or Uchiha handy, we had to interrogate a young kunoichi. Time sensitive. So we made implications, but no real threats, made our body language just so, and waited until the light was just right, and then I loosed the kunoichi's imagination. We did it too well and I didn't stay to supervise, which was a mistake. She brutalized herself so badly that she went into shock. What did you do? Well, she wasn't high value enough to keep as a prisoner, so once our window of opportunity to obtain the information closed, I killed her, Guzan-san replied. There's few injuries so difficult to heal as the ones you can inflict with genjutsu. Euphobia. Sakura had been laboring under a grueling mission schedule for months, sometimes with her peers, very occasionally leading squads, but mostly joining more experienced Chunin squads. But now she was receiving a more permanent assignment. She had tangled feelings. Resentment, because this assignment drove home the fact that Team 7 was scattered to the four corners and might never find its way together again. Excitement, because she was eager to find a place to belong again, to wrap herself in the comfort of a group identity. Sasuke might have sneered, but belonging was important. Ino's shadow had kept her safe from academy tormentors. Being included in Team 7 had been something to be proud of. She was tired of being pitted and shouted at in turns, ready to associate herself with something different even if it felt a little like a betrayal. She wasn't being assigned to another four-man cell, which made it slightly better. Konohagaku's Chunin ranks had been in disarray after the invasion. And what with mission demand, there hadn't been the luxury of carefully considering how to put all the broken pieces back together. Instead, they'd been using conglomerate teams, like the one they'd assembled for the mission to Mayako Asia. Tsunade-sama had slowly assembled new specialized teams, until the number of unaffiliated Chunin had shrunk to roughly the same levels as they'd been pre-invasion. But rather than continue to assemble teams herself or put more pressure on the mission office, Tsunade-sama was gathering the rest into 12-person units under the supervision of an experienced Chunin who would accept missions and assemble teams from their members as needed. Sakura was developing a real skill for research nowadays, learning who and when and where and what to ask to achieve an answer, but it hadn't been hard to find information on her new squad commander. Mariko had recognized the name of her team leader, but what she'd been able to tell Sakura hadn't been encouraging. Ehara Cho had only been a genin in the last war, but though the details on the how were sparse, both of her teammates had been killed and her Jounin sensei had committed suicide after returning the young girl to the village. She'd never integrated back into another four-man squad, had instead spent her career as a generalist but never gone on to become a Jounin. There were soundproofed rooms set aside for briefings and meetings for Jounin, but everyone else made do. Team 7's place had been a bridge. Her new team's place was a sunny terrace that overlooked an equally pleasant patio. Everyone else on the team had been working together for several weeks, or so she'd been told. Sakura was the last person to be assigned to the team. There was a set of exterior stairs that led upward onto the terrace, and Sakura's soft-soled boots were almost completely silent against the wood, but her appearance surprised no one. She took an 8 ninja lounging on comfortable padded benches, which made for more of an audience than she was perfectly comfortable with. It wasn't a hostile audience, though. Most of them were smiling, but not so broadly that it seemed mocking. All of them were older, which wasn't unexpected, but several of them appeared to be closer to her age than she'd expected. 16 to 20, if she had to guess, but a slightly older woman approached her before she could do more than take in the usual numbers divide of kunoichi to shinobi. For someone with a name as delicate and ephemeral as Ehara Cho, the woman was a study in irony. Her black hair was ruthlessly bobbed to her jawline, and while she was petite, her frame was sturdy and her hands were rough with calluses. And she had the iciest blue eyes Sakura had ever seen, like the winter sky she only ever saw in movies. Sakura ducked her head and offered greetings and an introduction. When she glanced up, those eyes hadn't precisely thawed, but some of the hard lines around her eyes had relaxed. "Welcome to the land of broken teams, Haruno," Ehara Taisha said. She followed this with a lightning round of introductions, which Sakura scrambled to follow, then dismissed most of the others. They'd apparently assembled only to nod hello to their newest member, which was sort of flattering. "I expect they told you a little about how this squad will operate?" "Yes, ma'am," Sakura replied promptly, then repeated what she'd been told. "Good memory," Ehara Taisha complimented her. "And they got it almost right. If we had about 3 months where I could drill you all together, it wouldn't be a problem to switch members in and out at will. As it is, I've paired everyone off, balancing the safety of someone who is very familiar with your fighting style with the flexibility of working with other pairs as needed. You have a surprisingly long mission record for such a recent promotion, with more high-ranked missions than I'd expect, she said, some hint of a question in the statement. Sakura didn't have a good answer for that. Kakashi-sensei using his influence wasn't exactly the impression she wanted to make, and the moment passed. I've known that you were going to be assigned to me since the squad was first being readied, and I've read your files, so I have some idea of your style. Chakra-enhanced strength, though not as refined as Tsunade-sama's, Ehara Taisha commented, one hand touching her opposite shoulder, elbow, and wrist in an echo of the black compression wraps that had made themselves a part of Sakura's wardrobe in an effort to alleviate the joint and muscle discomfort that was the price she was paying for her training. Also considerable speed training, something of a knife specialist. It was in your file that you're trained under Rado Namishi, and that Genma Shiranui had supervised your speed training. A dabbler in poisons. Your files have you classified as a genjutsu type, but it doesn't mention special training. Sakura still wasn't certain whether she would call what Guzen-san did teaching, because in all these months the old woman had shown her more about the nature of fear and the human mind than she'd ever wanted to know, but she'd never walked her through the use of a single technique. She kept silent, because that part of her life ruled by Guzen-san and her cynical view on people and the history of the village was somehow even more private than her books. It's not a bad resume for someone your age. It sounds, and there will come a time when I ask for a demonstration, very adaptable. So I paired you with someone equally flexible. Sakura glanced over the remaining ninja, but Ehara Taisha shook her head. Not here. We'll be going to meet him. Your partner is already in the field. Erythrophilia. The first time she met him, he was unremarkable in the way only truly excellent infiltrators are capable of. He'd even been described to her, and she was ashamed to admit she might not have looked twice at him if she'd not been looking specifically for him. His hand ghosted over her hip as he gently shifted her out of his path on his way through the packed room, his polite, "Sorry, excuse me," accompanied by a brief but impersonal smile. If she'd really been the 20-something woman whose face she was wearing, it might have been totally innocuous. As it was, there was a message in her pocket now, but its contents would have to wait until it was safe to leave. The second time, there was no mistaking him. His Hyuga bloodline was unmistakable in some things, like the color of his eyes and the shape of his face, but that was where it ended. His coffee-brown hair had a natural wave, and though he wore it traditionally long, he had it swept up into a messy knot. Those distinctive Hyuga eyes were partially concealed by glasses just as sleek and stylish as her own, only his lenses were tinted a somewhat startling red. And unlike most Hyuga she'd met, there was nothing traditional about his clothing choices. He had the panache and fashion sense of a rock star, a half-unzipped sleeveless vest with its fur-lined hood revealing the light armor common to ANBU, scarlet rather than white or gray, boots instead of sandals, loose black pants tucked into those boots. Hyuga Tatsuo. I've heard a lot about you, Haruno-san. Please treat me kindly. While his fashion was very modern, there was an easy, old-fashioned correctness to his manners. It's a pleasure to meet you, Sakura replied. I look forward to working with you. And while the words might have been rote, they certainly weren't a lie. Scotomophobia. Are you okay? Tatsuo asked worriedly as Sakura crouched down, the heels of her palms pressed hard against her aching eyes. Yes, she hissed, but she didn't move her hands, even as her temples ached with almost equal intensity. Tatsuo was skilled, trained in the Hyuga Juken style, and 17. Which made it perfectly normal for him to be quicker than her, but she'd been driving herself harder in her speed training in an effort to match her partner. Even outside of Shunshin he could move at speeds she couldn't follow without using chakra to artificially manipulate the speed at which her eyes and brain could process visual stimuli, so she'd been augmenting her eyes more often. For the first few weeks, it hadn't been an issue, but then had come the headaches. Not all the time, just occasionally. And now, something that felt like eye strain, if eye strain felt like someone jabbing a saban into her optic nerve. Tatsuo's hand settled on her shoulders. That doesn't look like okay, he observed gently. I'll be fine, she snapped, then tempered her voice and repeated, as if she could make herself believe it, I'll be fine. Canophilia. Ino's nails were biting into Sakura's arm and only tightened when she tried to pull away. "Alright, forehead girl," Ino said, "not only do you go clothes shopping without me, but you get assigned to a new team and you don't even introduce me to your new teammate?" Sakura winced at the real hurt that underlay Ino's anger. Team 10 had met her other Chunin friends, Mariko and Ri, Sakuya and his team, but she'd never introduced them to any of the members of a Harataishu's squad. It wasn't that she was ashamed of Team 10. She wasn't ashamed of her new squad either. But they weren't the way she'd assumed a squad should or would be, not like Team 10, or even Team 7. A Harataishu was her commander, not her friend. The others were her coworkers, which meant she got along with everyone, respected their contributions just as they respected hers, but no one went out of their way to socialize outside the celebratory dinners after a successful mission. There was an unspoken understanding that they weren't a real team, just the broken remnants of teams that were, and for most of them that loss was still too sharp to want to pretend otherwise. There was also the added complication of the work rotation. There were always pairs in the field, and it might be weeks before she worked with a particular pair again, which put a damper on any fledgling friendships that might have developed. So there was only Tatsuo, who'd once been a Tokubetsu jounin with a specialization in recon before an attack had ruined his eyes and they'd returned him to Chunin status. That had been offered in confidence, when she'd gotten a particularly blinding headache after a rough session of training. She'd already observed that he never used his Byakugan on missions, but she'd thought it was just an idiosyncrasy. As it turned out, he could only use his bloodline for a very brief time before the pain became debilitating. The ever-present sunglasses were to combat an extreme sensitivity to UV light, their tint to correct the color spectrum he saw the world in. The attack had done something to the chakra channels that were the key to the Byakugan, and the unleashed chakra had mutated the cells of his eyes in a way that most healers would find irreversible. She'd asked why he hadn't asked for Tsunade-sama to examine them. His answer had been an explanation of the clan law that prevented Tsunade-sama from meddling with the Jujutsu of clan members. They had their own medics for that, though non-clan medics could treat any other wounds. Her eyes trailed over to Tatsuo, who probably had no interest in hanging out with shinobi several years his junior. But he only smiled. "We were about to get something to eat. Would you like to come along?" Hodophobia. Takigakure would hold the next Chunin exam. It, alongside Amigakure, Kusugakure, and their erstwhile ally Suna had a treaty with Konoha that agreed to acknowledge a promotion awarded by the leader of any of these villages in the course of the Chunin exam. It was an honor to hold the exam, but it was also expensive in terms of resources. Not only did the host village have to provide security and proctors for the event, but it also lost whatever income those ninja might have provided if they'd been sent on missions instead. So it was also therefore a kind of boast. Konohagakure and Sunagakure hosted the exam far more often than the smaller villages, and when it was the turn of one of the less prosperous, populous villages, other villages often sent extra personnel along with the examinees to assist. This was doubly true after the fiasco of the last exams, because while it was assumed that Orochimaru's target had been Konoha and its Kage, no one was willing to trust that the snake had gone into hibernation. So it was that Sakura found herself traveling to the waterfall village as part of an extra security detail. Tatsuo was there, of course, and it was Shino and Shikamaru who rounded out the squad. For them, at least, it was convenient because their squads were retaking the exam, which in Takigakure did not require a team of 3. From what she'd been told during her briefing, their squad would be providing security for the Konoha contingent during the night. She'd not noticed it during her own exam, but Waterfall was instituting a curfew for the foreign ninja in an effort to prevent any trouble, so they would patrol the quarters assigned to the Leaf Shinobi. They were to make certain that no one snuck out or slipped in. To a long-ago Sakura, this might have produced a premonition of boredom, but the Sakura who walked to Takigakure kept her knives honed and treated the blades with topical anesthetic. Boredom was occasionally a welcome friend,